How short was France's sword when the Allies rushed to storm Europe? Never before had our country had such a limited armed force under such serious circumstances. The men who were now fighting for liberation of their homeland were saddened when they remembered the former strength of France. But never before had her army been of such high quality. Its revival was all the more remarkable because it had risen from the abysses of humiliation. For 14 centuries, military might has become second nature to France. Although our country has repeatedly neglected the cares of its defence, has not valued its soldiers, has lost battles, yet it has at all times appeared as a country capable of the greatest deeds of war. The vicissitudes of her fate in modern times have not changed the rule. No matter how weakened we were after the Napoleonic epic, no matter how cruel a blow the defeat of 1870 was to us, we have retained the psychology and capacity for action characteristic of strong nations. In 1918, the victory was mainly our own doing. We came to it ourselves and led others. And of course we believed that our army was head and shoulders above all the armies in the world, our navy one of the best, our aviation superb, our generals the most gifted. No wonder that the catastrophe of 1940 and the humiliation that followed it seemed to many a monstrous, irreparable disaster. Suddenly, the image that the French had of themselves and the historically established opinion of the whole world about them collapsed. And if France had not regained her fighting ability, there would have been no way for her to regain her dignity, either in her own eyes or in the eyes of others. And nothing helped her so much to revive her unity and her prestige as the astonishing fact that she was able to find in the overseas territories barely gathered under her rule, and in the oppressed metropolis enough faith in her and enough military valour to forge again an army that, honest spruce. After Sedan and Dunkirk, after the surrender at Ritondi and the surrender of Vichy at Turin, after the complete readiness of Vichy to reconcile itself to military defeat, after the enslavement of the state, what a striking turnaround! Our armed forces took a serious part in winning victory, fought brilliantly at a time when the enemy had taken almost the whole of our country, held 2 million Frenchmen prisoner when the legitimate government was punishing with particular zeal the fighters for the freedom of the fatherland. There were enough men of conscription age in Africa so that we had no difficulty in recruiting a contingent to form an active army. But our options were limited. We could take as many soldiers as we wanted from the native population of Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Black Africa, and Madagascar. But the number of regular or reserve officers was, on the contrary, very limited. For the most part, only Frenchmen by descent made up these categories, necessary for the formation of large military units. However, there were only 1,200,000 French souls in these dominions. True, having mobilized all the conscription years up to 1918, we got 116,000 men. This was not insignificant, considering that many Frenchmen were needed in the fields of administrative, economic maintenance of public order, and that many soldiers had been in German captivity since 1940. It is true that Free France brought 15,000 young Frenchmen. Corsica gave 13,000 soldiers. 12,000 young men escaped from France through Spain and made their way to us. 6,000 women and girls joined our various services. It is true that the conscripts were in a hurry to join the army. And in spite of all this, we had insufficient manpower to recruit commanders and specialists. It should be added that the Americans, who supplied us with arms, equipment, and uniforms, made it a condition that we adopt their own rules of army organization. With regard to contingents, they were supposed to generously allocate men for all kinds of services and to have numerous flying detachments to make up for losses. According to their rules, the action of fighting units must be supported by richly equipped rearguards. They agreed to arm the French divisions only after an inspection, which was supposed to show that the combat units were given adequate rear services, staffed with numerous and qualified personnel. And our troops in Africa, accustomed to live in difficult conditions, considered it a waste to allocate so many people to parks, warehouses, wagons, and workshops. Because of this, there were frequent and sometimes unpleasant disputes between the Allied General Staff and our headquarters, and yet the French had to painfully fragment beautiful regiments to form them into auxiliary units. General Giraud was the first unwilling to reconcile himself to this. Having heard Roosevelt promise at the conference at Anfa that the United States would furnish equipment for any number of military units we might be able to form, he hoped to be able to outfit and equip 14 French divisions and was about to commit the few rearguard services. And how chagrined, how indignant he was, when the foreign controllers, before distributing the long-awaited war materials, demanded that the auxiliary services should be fully manned and therefore that the line units should be correspondingly reduced. And in addition, we needed to keep at least a minimum number of troops on our African territories guarding our sovereignty. And finally, we reserved 2 brigades to send them at the first opportunity to Indochina. The Guard troops and these 2 brigades were equipped with French arms, and their structure did not depend on the American scheme. But they were absorbing our cadres and thus diminishing the resources of the active army. As for me, though I felt how heavy the demands of the Americans, who made it a condition of supplying us with war material to submit to their schemes, I still felt that the campaign in Europe, which was soon to come, would indeed require very strong auxiliary troops. Besides, I wanted to put an end to the interruption of the supply of arms. Becoming the sole head of government, I settled the matter. On the basis of information about the available contingent of our military units, data on their composition, and taking into account the conditions under which the Allies agreed to supply us with arms and equipment, I decreed on January 7, 1944, established the following composition of ground forces intended for the Battle of France. The command of the army, the command of 3 army corps, 6 infantry divisions, 4 armoured divisions with the necessary services and additions. Of the troops provided for in this programme, 1 infantry division and 1 armoured division we could not fully form in the required time. But we managed to give our large units 3 Moroccan groups, 2 regiments of paratroopers and landing teams. A great deal of work was done by the General Staff under General Lai to create, with all the shortages and interruptions, exemplary military units that France was able to put into combat in Italy, and then transported them to the metropolis to throw them against Germany and Austria. Our navy showed no less energy. It was absorbed in machinery, which is the life and passion of sailors. It distracted them from the agonizing thoughts of recent troubles. Gradually the fleet recovered and was already taking part in naval battles. Admiral Lemonnier, appointed in July 1943 Chief of Staff, showed in this reorganization of his great ability and, wow, for all his diplomatic sensitivity, a strong will. On October 14, 1943, the National Defense Committee approved the armament plan proposed by Lemonnier. The plan called for the following ships to be placed on alert by next spring: 2 battleships Richelieu and Lorraine, 9 cruisers Gloire, Georges League, Montcalm, Émile Bertin, Jeanne d'Arc, Du Guay-Truin, Duquesne, Suffren, Touville, 4 light cruisers Fantasque, Melaine, Terribles, Triomphant, 3 auxiliary cruisers, Cap de Palme, Kersey, Barfleur, 2 aircraft carriers, Béarn, Dixmude, 14 destroyers, 18 submarines, 80 small craft, convoy ships, oilers, patrol ships, minesweepers, submarine hunters. The plan called for equipping the ships with the latest guns and making the necessary repairs, which, however, the dilapidated Bizerte arsenal and the Casablanca arsenal, with its limited facilities, and the Dakar arsenal, still in its infancy, could not fully accomplish. But the Allied bases at Brooklyn and Bermuda kindly undertook it, and thus the programme could be carried out. The envisaged number of ships was even exceeded. We returned once captured by the Italians' destroyers Tiger and Trom submarine Bronzo, received the former name of Narwhal. 4 frigates we ceded the British. Part of the convoy destroyers gave the Americans, and the first of them, Sénégalais, was solemnly handed over to our fleet President Roosevelt. 6 squadrons of seaplanes, consisting of Sunderlanders and Wellingtons, were also formed, and French planes reappeared in the Atlantic. Finally, the Navy gave 2 armoured regiments, 1 division of heavy field artillery, and landing parties to take part in the fighting, and 22 shore batteries and 7 anti-aircraft barges, manned by sailors, assisted in the defence of African and Corsican ports. According to a plan proposed by General Busker and approved by the National Defense Committee on 2002 October, our Air Force in 1944 was to consist of 30 air groups. 7 air groups had bases in England. 21 air groups operated in the Mediterranean area, including 8 fighter groups, 4 bomber groups, 6 coastal defence groups, 1 reconnaissance group, and 2 transport air groups. 2 fighter air groups fought in Russia. In Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia, the French aircraft in essence left after fighting with the Americans, and here yesterday's enemies generously pledged to supply aircraft to our squadrons based in North Africa. The British and the Russians equipped with equipment are air groups located in their territories. Busker with his characteristic methodical and authoritative command of the French Air Force. immediately received new aircraft and immediately included in the Allied Air Force, the rules and techniques of which they still had to learn, but more than ever our pilots were eager to fight. In general, we were able to put up an active army of 230,000 men, a guard force for overseas territories of 150,000 soldiers, a fleet of 320,000 tons, cargo ships and steamships with a displacement of 1,200,000 tons, and two-thirds of the ships could have a French crew, aviation in the number of 500 combat aircraft, with flying and maintenance staff of 30,000 people. Most of the military equipment was to be provided to us by the Allies on the basis of agreements on Lend-Lease, and in compensation on our part counted the services that we rendered to the Allies by providing ports, transport communications, means of communication, various kinds of equipment, labour, etc. The morale of our armies was favourably affected by the joyful consciousness that the very meaning of their existence had been restored, that they had been freed from the oaths they had taken, and all the spells which had shackled or confused a large part of the soldiers. It was necessary to see with what fervent zeal our land troops and naval crews mastered the latest equipment, what enthusiasm caused in the units assigned to the front the order to march. During this period I inspected every regiment, every ship, every squadron of airplanes. In the eyes of every soldier I read pride in their weapons. The French have a military spirit. The Maquis proved it. Up to the end of 1942, the Maquis units were few in number and their actions were not particularly effective. But then hope grew, and with it the number of those who wanted to fight. In addition, the compulsory conscription, which mobilized 500,000 young men, mostly workers, for a few months for use in Germany, and the disbanding of the Armistice Army encouraged many dissenters to go underground. The number of more or less substantial resistance groups increased, and they waged a guerrilla warfare that played a paramount role in wearing down the enemy and later in the unfolding battle for France. The conditions in which these autonomous units were formed, lived and fought were, of course, very varied and depended on the nature of the terrain in which they operated and the weapons available to them, and then the natural barriers of France regained the importance they had had when the Celts, and then the Gauls, and after them the Franks, everywhere defended their country in great and small battles against the invaders, the Germans, the Romans, the Saracens, the Central Massif, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Jura, the Vosges, the Ardennes forests. The interior of Brittany attracted guerrilla units most of all. Incidentally, it was there that Allied planes found the most convenient places where they could deliver intelligence agents or drop people and containers by parachute, away from the seashores, from the big centres. From the main communications, the occupiers were not so dense, and the police supervision was less strict. The old gorge-ridden wooded mountains of Auvergne, Limousin, Cévennes, and Lannemezan, the high plateaus of the alpine ranges in Savoy and Dauphiné, the secluded nooks in the forest thickets and among the ledges of the Vosges, Jurassic, Langrian, Morvan uplands, the steep slopes of the French and Belgian Ardennes. The Landes, dense thickets, ravines, and lakeshore served the partisans as a refuge during long days of waiting, as a springboard for attacking the enemy, and as rear positions for withdrawal after the battle. Who was it that spoke of meek France? The Maquis usually consisted of several dozen men. The maximum number of people that could be grouped in one place, given the size of the catches and the difficulty of supplying them. One could only get into them by means of a tangled rope, for many precautions were taken in their defence. If a man joined a detachment, it was irrevocable. One had to live in dugouts, in huts, in caves, sometimes in a barn, in a ruined farm, in a forest gatehouse. It was necessary to endure severe hardships, hunger, cold, rain, and most importantly, not to know a moment of peace, always on the alert and at any moment to be ready to move to another place. As far as possible, the guerrillas were warned of danger or given the opportunity to act by their own network of sympathizers, which covered the entire district. Even gendarmerie posts, even administrative offices, neighboring farms and villages supplied the small army with food supplies. Children, girls, and old men served the troop as liaisons and ordinaries, without attracting the attention of the enemy. Sullenly, silently, the French peasantry helped these brave lads. The invaders took revenge by shooting civilians, grabbing those whom they suspected of complicity with the partisans, hijacked to Germany local figures, burned entire villages. To ambush a German convoy, to derail a train carrying German soldiers or war materials, to attack a hesitant patrol or a poorly guarded post, to set fire to cars assembled in the enemy's motor pool, to blow up a tank of gasoline or a store of shells. These were the sabotages in which the guerrillas were mainly engaged until the day when the landing of Allied troops in France opened a wider field of activity. If the detachment decided to make a sortie, it had to be carefully prepared. Since there were few men and weapons, the operation had to be carried out quickly, because its success depended on the suddenness of the attack, and as soon as it was completed, it was necessary to immediately withdraw and hide, because immediately the enemy sent the whole hordes, and they set up barricades on the roads, combing the neighbourhood. Having taken refuge from the Punishes, the guerrillas, still without a break, summarized the operation. How they were triumphant when under their bullets fell Wehrmacht soldiers, when German trucks were burning, overturned cars, when before their eyes panic-stricken Germans were fleeing, throwing weapons, and it went to the partisans. But alas, how often the enemy surrounded the partisan detachment. Then there was a fight not for life, but for death. The surviving French, if they could not escape, were killed on the spot or, having arranged a comedy of judgment, shot immediately by the roadside. Some died standing up, others prostrate on the ground if their wounds prevented them from standing up. But the executed looked the German killers in the face, and everyone's last cry was, "Long live France." Later, a gravestone placed at the place of execution would be a reminder that they died here. The Lorraine cross carved in stone will tell why and how they died. But in a large part of the country, the terrain conditions were such that it was impossible for a guerrilla unit to take safe cover. Then the unit would split into very small groups, or the resistance members would live underground on their own. They were provided with false documents and put to work, some in logging, some in quarries, some in highway repair. They slept in isolated farms or tried to get lost in big cities. Often factories, construction sites and offices provided them with cover. The guerrillas took advantage of it, waiting for the right moment to sabotage, and once they had done so, they disappeared. These scattered fighters could not act on a large scale, but they made themselves increasingly known. The Germans no longer dared to go alone. They were killed. Fans were torn under the feet of the occupiers. Toka balls disabled German cars. In Paris, in the north of France, in Lyons and in other industrial areas, small-scale sabotage in production became a constant phenomenon, to such an extent that we had to create a special service of protection against sabotage in those enterprises that in the near future could be needed for our armies. Of course, it is impossible nowadays to ascertain the exact contingent of all these elements, which did not provide anyone with staff sheets and lists. At the beginning of 1943, when the secret army was created, we estimated its strength at about 40,000 people. Yes, thousands of 30 Frenchmen and Frenchwomen were part of the network of resistance organizations united by 6 dozen groups. A year later, there were at least 100,000 men in partisan units, and when the Battle of France began, the number exceeded 200,000. The actual size of the contingents of internal fighters was in direct correlation with the weapons they were given. If it happened that the group received all the weapons it needed, it was immediately joined by volunteers. Conversely, the commander of an ill-equipped unit had to refuse fighters who wanted to join his ranks. Of course, the supply of arms to the resistance organizations was one of the most important concerns of the government. In France itself, the capacity to do so was very weak. Of course, in 1940, some commanders hid weapons, but almost all the catches were discovered by the enemy or given to him by Vichy himself, and the partisans had only a small number of French weapons. We, however, managed to send them weapons from North Africa, but not much. We themselves have almost none, and the bases from which our aircraft departed were too far from France. As for the weapons that the partisans took from the Germans, the number of them became significant only during the big battles in the summer of 1944. So the masters of the much-needed weapons were the Allies, but despite my persistent and frequent statements, they agreed to send their specialized planes to France and to drop rifles, machine guns, pistols, grenades, machine guns, mortars on its territory only on condition of full knowledge of all circumstances. After all, despite all precautions, half of the military materials dropped by parachute fell into enemy hands. In addition, if the secret American and especially secret British services gradually realized what to expect from the French resistance, the command of the Allied forces was not soon able to appreciate how effective this form of warfare, completely new to the headquarters, aimed only to lead those battles that are conducted according to all the rules. until the very end of the war was not overcome the cruel gap between the demands and sometimes desperate pleas of the guerrillas and what they were directed. In all, our underground units were still provided with over 500,000 rifles, pistols, and other weapons of individual use and 4,000 guns of collective use. 4/5 of the war materials were obtained from our allies. The guerrilla units, the resistance organizations that supported them, the propaganda that helped them, all this required money. The government endeavoured to deliver them in currency that could be circulated in France and would not excite suspicion. At first we used all our stock of French bank tickets kept in England, in Africa, and in the Antilles. Then we began to send liberation coupons issued by the government in Algeria and guaranteed by it. Our delegation in Paris accepted these coupons and secretly exchanged them for money in credit institutions or from private individuals. At the height of the struggle, at the moment of the most extreme need for money, there were cases when the leaders of the groups resorted to requisitioning the funds, but the state then reimbursed these withdrawals. In total, more than 15 billion was officially distributed among the resistance organizations, a sum that at today's exchange rate equals 100 billion. Of course, there were the inevitable abuses, but overall, 3/4 of the expenditures, according to the Treasury report, were properly justified. Where did the leaders of the internal forces come from? Almost invariably, they themselves took charge of the unit when the men recognized that these men were worthy and capable of leading them. Most of them justified this trust. Some were guilty of reprehensible actions, but these were the exception. If we remember the circumstances under which they took their post, if we take into account that the command staff in the mass of them not so quickly renounced Vichy and did not immediately lead the battle groups, it must be recognized that these new leaders, who devoted themselves to the most difficult and dangerous task, well served the homeland. However, as soon as the former free zone was occupied, the Armistice Army was dissolved and faith in Marshal Pétain and in the legitimacy of his authority was shaken. Many career officers and non-commissioned officers under the influence of the aura and its head, General Revere, went to the McQueen. As long as the underground forces acted spontaneously, depending on the occasion, and acted as separate, unconnected units, there was no question of introducing the hierarchy and structure of the regular army into them. It was not possible to send them from Algiers or from London assignments, specifying exactly where and in what place they were to be carried out. But to leave them to themselves, without linking them to central authority, would have been extremely risky. They could have descended into the anarchy of the Forest Brothers or fallen under the prevailing communist influence. Indeed, the communists were the main core and often the commanding officers of the Fran. Terror-partisan movement, which constituted almost 1/3 of the underground forces. If de Gaulle had not kept all the armed units under his command, this part of them would have stood apart and would have been controlled not by the state authority, but by those who sought to seize power. In addition, other elements, not knowing whom to join, would also have gravitated towards this organization, and it would have pulled them under. Incidentally, just at this time, the communists were trying hard to take over the National Council of the Resistance, to force it to take a kind of governmental position in Algeria, and to unite the underground groups with the help of the Action Committee, in which they themselves played a dominant role. And so we set up a system in France, which, without constricting the initiative of the underground forces and their division into groupings, linked them to the French command and made them feel this link in action. For each administrative district and for certain departments, the government appointed a military delegate allocated personally by me. He established contact with the armed groups of his area, coordinated their actions, communicated with our centre by means of a radio station which he possessed, transmitted our instructions to them and communicated their requests to us, and regulated with our services the air operations for the delivery of weapons to thy parachute. The guerrilla units now had inspectors. Michel Brault was appointed for the whole of France, Georges Rebate for the southern zone, and André Brozin-Favreau for the northern zone. When the enemy arrested General de Lestrade, his deputy General de Mars, and his aide Colonel Gastaldo, we appointed Colonel Desjoyeuses as Chief of Staff of the Secret Army. In addition, I appointed a national military delegate, that is, a staff officer who was the representative of the command for all the combat elements. The guerrilla underground, the intelligence network, the brigades for organizing sabotage, and he was also my representative on the National Council of the Resistance. This duty, which required great flexibility and firmness, was carried out one by one. Louis Mangin, Colonel Elimi Ruiz, Borges Monarij Shabandelmas. In certain areas with favourable conditions, our internal forces were increasing, while in enemy units there were signs of panic fear. In such places joint operations became possible, and then one of the commanders of the underground fighting groups, whether or not he was a career officer, took command of all or part of our fighting forces in a given sector. In Haute-Savoie, Major Valette Dozier; in Aisne, Colonel Roman Petit; in Brittany, General Audibert; Coles, Guinaudot; in Ailey and Vilaine, Maurice; in Morbihan, Gary, Gardin, Gangwin; in Auvergne and Limousin, André Malrot; in Corrèze, Lowe, Dorda, Ravenel; in Haute-Garonne, Pommier; in Pyrénées, Adeline; in Girona, Granville; in Lorraine, Chevans Bertin; in Provence, Rolle and de Marguerite; in Paris, Chaumel; in Touraine, General Bertrand; in Berrios, etc. But from the moment of the Allied landing in France, it was necessary to get these dispersed elements to assist the operations of the Allied forces, and consequently the military command had to give them certain tasks and provide them with the means of carrying them out. With regard to the destruction which was to restrain the enemy's movements, we had a general plan which we had long ago worked out with the participation of specialists competent in each of the branches of interest. There was, for example, the Green Plan proposed by the leaders of the resistance on the railroads RD, Armand, and others. There was the Lilac Plan, drawn up with the assistance of the members of the resistance by the communications workers, especially with the help of Debermarket. There was the Tortoise Plan, in which it was planned to cut the roads in the most important places, with Rondinet as its chief executor. There was also the Blue Plan, in which measures were planned for the seizure of the power stations. But, on the other hand, it was necessary that the actions of local underground groups at the right moment acquired national significance, would become the performance of the entire country, and took a sufficiently stable character, could become an element of the strategy of the Allies. It was necessary that detachments of the secret army merged with our other troops into a single French army. That is why, in March 1944, I created the French Internal Force, which was obligatory to include all clandestine armed groups, and it was prescribed that they should, as far as possible, be organized into military units corresponding to our statutes, platoons, companies, battalions, regiments. It was decided that the officers commanding these units would temporarily wear ranks corresponding to the contingent under them. Of course, we foresaw that in terms of the number of patches on the beret and on the sleeve, this order would in many cases cause great exaggerations, which would later have to be sorted out by the certification commissions. But I believed that by subjecting these troops to our traditional rules, to which incidentally they themselves aspired, I would ultimately serve the cause of French unity. In April, I appointed General Koenig commander of the internal forces and sent him to England to help Eisenhower. From England, it was most convenient for him to direct the actions of the resistance forces, so that they contribute to the overall strategic plan, to communicate with our internal troops in every possible way, to deliver them weapons and provide any other support. Koenig, moreover, took under his command foreign groups under the names of Alliance, Buckmeister, War Office, etc., which the Allies had until then directly employed on our territory. How was France to utilize the armed forces which she had succeeded in reconstituting? The dualism in the government prevented us from taking certain decisions for some time yet, but it was only after the Tunisian campaign and before the Italian campaign, that is, during a period of relative calm. Besides, it turned out that in General Giraud's views in this respect were similar to mine. But in the fall of 1943 opened the prospect of an offensive on the continent. At that time, I became the sole chairman of the committee. When it was necessary to act, I could already make decisions, but within narrow limits, and I confess in conditions difficult for me, because in the Allied coalition forces of France were not the main. My thoughts on how we should conduct the war determined as early as 1940, let our army, re-established in Africa, enter the metropolis, fight together with the forces of the secret detachments for the freedom of the fatherland, take part in the invasion of the Reich, and in the course of the struggle provide us with the desired collateral, so that the final settlement of the question could not take place without our participation. This required that the Allied military action should be directed toward our territory, that it should include not only a landing in northern France, but also a landing in the south, with our extensive participation in the operation. Until then, it was good that the Western forces are campaigning Italy. Good, because they exhaust the Germans and in addition free the sea lanes. And, of course, our troops, our navy, our aviation should be included in these hostilities. However, Allied strategic plans were still uncertain. In September 1943, the Allies decided to take on Italy, but they disagreed on how to proceed. The United States now felt capable of waging battle in Europe by taking the shortest route, that is, through France, to enter the land of Normandy and thence move on Paris. To make a landing in Provence and go up the valley of the Rhône were the intentions. They wanted to combine both these operations. Following this, the Allied armies connecting between Switzerland and the North Sea will cross the Rhine. The Americans considered the Italian campaign as a side affair, which should not divert attention from the main task. The British, and above all Churchill, looked at the situation differently. In their view, the Americans planned to attack the enemy where it is most difficult to do it, wanted to grab the bull by the horns. It would have been much better to target vulnerable places, to smash the beast in its soft underbelly, instead of the object of their actions directly called Germany, and passing through France. To reach it, according to the British, it was necessary to move through Italy and the Balkans in the Danube countries of Europe. The great effort of the Allies should therefore consist of the following: to move forward on the Italian peninsula, in addition to make a landing in Greece and Yugoslavia, to achieve the entry of Turkey into the war, and then enter Austria, Bohemia, Hungary. Of course, this strategic plan was in line with a policy of London, which sought to establish the dominance of England in the Mediterranean Sea and above all feared how instead of the Germans there would not be the Russians. We knew that the British defended their plan in every possible way at the Tehran and Cairo conferences, in the letters of the Prime Minister of England to President Roosevelt, and in the established in Washington Anglo-Saxon body, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But no matter how hard our allies tried to keep us out of their meetings, we now had a fairly substantial armed forces, and we could not be discounted. Although I found some of the points in Churchill's concept tempting, I could not agree with it. From the point of view of military operations, the operation proposed to be launched from the Mediterranean coast in the direction of Central Europe was too risky. Let's assume that it will be possible to quickly defeat the enemy troops occupied Italy. But after that, it was still necessary to overcome a huge obstacle: the Alps. If it was possible to land in Dalmatia, then how to get out of the Yugoslavian mountains? Greece, of course, is more accessible, but further to the north. What obstacles are the complex massifs of the Balkans? And after all, American and British armies are designed mainly for action on the plains with the increased support of military equipment, and they are accustomed to live without much deprivation thanks to regular supplies. I could not imagine how they would move through the mountainous areas of the Balkan Peninsula, where there are no convenient ports that would serve the Allies as naval bases, where there are few roads, and those in poor condition, where the trains run rarely and slowly, and meanwhile will have to deal with the Germans, who will have time to cleverly use the barriers created by nature itself. No, to seek a solution to the question had to be in France, where the territory was favourable to rapid operations, where the air and sea bases were close, and the resistance units operating behind enemy lines would be in the offensive Allied forces would be the biggest trump card. So in the name of the interests of France, I felt obliged, as far as it was possible for me, to resist the plan of the British. Could the powers of the West be allowed to send their troops past our country while it was enslaved by the enemy? Would our country be liberated from afar and indirectly, and would she not see a saving victory won on her soil by our soldiers and their allies? Can we allow the last of her army to move on Prague while Paris, Lyons, Strasbourg will remain for a long time yet in the hands of the enemy? If we do not allow our armed forces, forged in the overseas territories, to fight and win in the metropolis, shall we not then miss the opportunity of strengthening the bonds which unite the French alliance? And finally, in the confusion that will appear in the country after the retreat of the Germans and the collapse of Vichy, what regime will arise out of the chaos if our army is in Austria or Hungary and cannot merge with the internal forces? England and the United States were interested in the choice of a strategic plan from the point of view of their politics, but for France her whole destiny depended on this choice. It happened that quite early on the American point of view prevailed regarding the landing in northern France. In December 1943, our Anglo-Saxon allies, who were greatly hurried by the Russians, decided to carry out this grandiose operation called Overlord. We, of course, approved of this intention. But the landing in the south, although it was decided in principle and christened in advance with the name Enville, still caused much controversy. Churchill did not give up the idea of transferring to Italy and the Balkans all Allied military operations in the south of Europe. He achieved that General Maitland Wilson was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Theatre. Alexander was already at the head of the armies in Italy. Churchill insisted that they were given as many American and French divisions and special landing craft. If there is no opposition from our side, then at the insistence of the Prime Minister in the southern theatre of the war can be applied to the English plan. But how are we to intervene, considering our stake in the game and the forces we could field at this period of the war? It would be natural to involve us in working out the principal decisions of the Allied coalition. Let the head of the French government take part in the conferences where the President of the United States and the English Prime Minister were discussing war plans. Let the French commanders assign a representative, General Girard, for example, to the Allied General Staff where war plans were being formulated. Then we would be in a position to defend our point of view and influence the decisions made. Then the Allied strategic plans, and we would have considered our plans on an equal footing with the two powers that and if, in that case, the execution of the landing operation in northern France had been entrusted to an American general and in the south to an English general, we would look back on our past with sadness, but we would not feel anxious about the present and future of the country. But the Anglo-Saxons never agreed to treat us as true allies. Never have they consulted us as government to government, for reasons of policy, or because it was convenient for them. They agreed to use the French armed forces for tasks which they themselves assigned to them, but they used them as if our troops belonged to the Allies on the sole ground that they were supplying us with arms. I could not reconcile myself to such a philosophy. I believed that the assistance which France in every respect rendered to the coalition was far more valuable than the war material with which it was supplied. As the Allies did not involve her in the discussion of their plans, I felt that I was doing the right thing whenever I had to act independently of them, at my own risk. It was not without clashes, but this had to be reconciled, for afterwards all became convinced that in defending the interests of France, we were at the same time acting for the common good. In December there was an opportunity to show that, in the current situation, we leave ourselves free to act. At that time, operations in Italy began. 3 French divisions were already there. Frankly speaking, the third of these divisions, the 4th Moroccan, the Allies were not in a hurry to transfer to the Apennine Peninsula. They preferred that we confine ourselves to sending reinforcements, allocating for this purpose a few battalions for the troops of General Juin. I had to intervene, me. I did not want the 4th Moroccan Division to be fragmented. It was necessary to send the whole of it. So we did, and one could only be glad of it when it showed itself on the battlefield. In the meantime, the Allied command changed its view and proposed to General Girard to send a 4th Major Unit to Italy. The National Defence Committee decided to accede to the Allied request and chose the 1st Free French Division to send. And suddenly we learn that it will not be sent, and instead, by order of General Eisenhower, appointed to send the 9th Colonial Division. I immediately ordered that Eisenhower be notified that the 9th Division was not at his disposal and that it would remain in North Africa. Then Eisenhower referred, on the one hand, to some unknown agreement between him and General Girard, and on the other hand, the terms of the agreement concluded at the conference in Antwerp between Girard and Roosevelt, according to which the French troops armed by Americans should be at the full disposal of the American command. Such arguments only confirmed me in my position. I reaffirmed my decision. I then notified Edwin Wilson and Harold Macmillan that we proposed to settle between the 3 governments the question of the conditions under which French armed forces could be used by the Allied command along with American and British troops. Some confusion ensued. The Allied General Headquarters protested, claiming that our mode of action was detrimental to military operations. The embassies, on the other hand, declared that the matter did not concern the Washington and London governments and should be settled between General Eisenhower and the Liberation Committee. And since our troops did not move from North Africa while they were needed in Italy, had to explain themselves to us, on December 27, as we had anticipated from the beginning, the conference met under my chairmanship, attended by Wilson, Macmillan, and General Bedell Smith. He was replacing the absentee Eisenhower. My assistants were René Massigli and General Girard. I notified the conference that the 1st Division, and no other, would be placed at the disposal of the Allied Commander-in-Chief as soon as we were duly requested to send it. It goes without saying that no French armed forces can be used in any theatre of war without the permission of the French government. I then remarked that the incident which had occurred had induced us to specify the conditions on which the French government intended to carry out the cooperation of its armed forces with those of the Allies. "We certainly want this cooperation," I said, "but it is necessary that we should know its terms. After all, we are detached from the working out of your plans. Just in case, we have prepared a draft agreement intended to remedy the deplorable state of affairs, to organize the cooperation of the three governments in the general direction of the war, and the cooperation of the three commands in the field of strategy. If we conclude the agreement, everything will go fine. If we, the French government will place its armed forces under the Allied command only on such terms as it determines, reserving the right to withdraw its troops in whole or in part if it considers that the national interest requires it." And he added, "At present the Allied command is being assisted in the Italian campaign by our army, our navy, our air force, and we still do not know what they are being used for and how they are being used there. Of the utmost importance to us are the forthcoming landing operations in France. It is time to say that we will not be able to send reinforcements to our troops in Italy, or even to leave in Italy those troops already sent there, unless the American and British governments give us guarantees that Operation Envil will be carried out, that all the French armed forces now operating in Italy, as well as the troops we have in North Africa, will take part in it, and that one French division will be transferred to England in time to take part in Operation Overlord and liberate Paris. If these assurances are given but subsequently prove to be broken, French troops will again be at the disposal of the French government." The next day Massigli submitted in writing to Wilson and Macmillan our proposals and conditions. He received a reply from them, informing him that our draft had been referred to their governments for consideration, and that in the meantime we were given the assurances we had asked for in regard to the French campaign, and then we resumed the movement of our troops into Italy. Since that time the Allied commanders have not neglected to inform us of their plans, to ask our opinion, and to send us requests for reinforcements by the proper means. At Algiers, quite satisfactory cooperation between the general staffs was established. For my part, I received many American and British military leaders. Thus, I received General Eisenhower, Air Marshal Ted and General Bedell Smith before their departure for England, where they were to prepare Operation Overlord and then throw troops into its execution. General Maitland Wilson, when he arrived to take up his post as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces in the Mediterranean, and then on several other occasions. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, Admiral Hewitt, to whom were entrusted the operations of transport, escort, protection, and landing of the troops which the Enville Plan would require. General Doolittle, Commander of the Strategic Air Forces in the Mediterranean Theatre. Generals Devers, Guillemot, and Rox. Air Marshal Slessor, and during inspection trips to Italy. I was informed with full confidence of their plans and informed about the views of the French government commander of the Allied forces. General Alexander, Commander of the 5th American Army, General Clark, Commander of the 8th British Army, General Lees, Commander of the Air Force, General Eicher. All of them informed me of their intentions and familiarized me with the French point of view. The position of these military figures, no doubt, was in the interests of the common cause, but in their relations with de Gaulle, they had to overcome a sense of surprise, by the way, quite understandable. Prone to conformism, British and American generals could not help but be surprised by the head of state, which has no constitution, no voters, no capital, but speaks in the name of France, an officer who has so few stars and whose orders ministers, generals, admirals, governors and ambassadors of his country consider for themselves unquestionable, a Frenchman who was sentenced to death by the legitimate government and denigrated by many Vichy dignitaries, with whom some of the French troops fought, then bowed before him. I must say that they discovered an understanding of things and saw France for what it was. I, on the other hand, responded to these distinguished figures, faithful servants of their fatherland and our common cause, these upright men and brave soldiers, with feelings of deep respect and friendship. It must be noted that the organization with which they dealt in their communications with us facilitated our contacts. Since the French government had only one head, it shared with no one the right to make decisions and the duty to be responsible for them. Our command structure was extremely simple and clear, relying on the law on the organization of the nation in time of war, As head of state, I had the title of head of the armed forces, and as president of the government, I was obliged to direct national defense. I was directly concerned with the utilization of our armed forces, and consequently with strategic cooperation with our allies, within the framework of the general plan which I determined. The Minister of War. The Minister of Aviation had to form and manage armies and to settle with the American and British services the question of supplying us with arms. Finally, the military chiefs I appointed exercised in one territory or another the command of our armed forces within the Allied system. Exactly the same functions and on the same grounds were performed by Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin. The difference was, alas, in the significant preponderance of their combat assets over ours. In order to have assistance in the performance of my task, I created the main staff of national defense and at the head of it put General Bethuet, appointing his deputy captain first rank Barjot and Colonel Aviation de Rancourt. It was Bethuet's responsibility to prepare materials for decisions, to notify those concerned, and to supervise their implementation. In addition, he provided contacts with the highest Allied military institutions, kept in touch with the Commander-in-Chief, first with Eisenhower and then with Wilson, and was in charge of the missions of our land, sea, and air forces abroad. Not to mention the stringent demands I myself made on him. His duties were quite difficult, both because of their complexity and because he had to hurt the ego of the governments and the chief staffs of the Allied forces, ministers and high French authorities, as well as individuals. But it must be said that Bethuet excelled in his work, achieving for France a kind of promotion in the ranks of the coalition. We knew that the personal qualities of our generals, commanding large units, will play a big role here. And it was our commanders who were good, determine on the spot the position of the enemy, terrain conditions, methods of action, combine different types of weapons to enthuse the troops. That's what division commanders must be able to do, and in this art distinguished, each in his own way. Generals Doudy de Montsabat, Sevez, Leclerc de Hautecloque, Duvigier de Vernejoul, Guillaume Brosset, Generals Poidenot and Chale excelled in the use of artillery, guns of all calibers. General Dromer, who headed the engineer-sapper troops, could certainly ensure that our soldiers could pass through any obstacles and eventually cross the Rhine. At the head of the army corps should stand a man with a broad outlook and foresight, able to merge in a single blow of different simultaneous actions of large forces. Generals Henry Martin and de la Mina, our first corps commanders, brilliantly proved their gifts. It must be said, however, that the very circumstances inspired them, and in the forces they did not lack. How happy commanders are when they feel that they are waiting for victory at sea for the reason that the enemy could no longer introduce significant forces into the battle. The war consisted in the actions of our individual units, distributed over vast areas to hunt for submarines, to destroy raiders, to protect against enemy escort transports and defense of our bases. Thus, the fighting was done by our warships embedded in the Allied system. French admirals, who had equal rights with their British and American counterparts, were able to provide effective assistance in this struggle at sea, which now and then attacked by surprise, as in a card game when there are not enough trumps, but our sailors were able to uphold the honour of the French fleet. Lemonnier did it as the leader of all our naval forces, and at the head of individual compounds distinguished Dargenlieu, Collinet, Nomi, Obuano, Ronark, Bart, Lungo, Missoff, Butty, and others. Our aviation, due to circumstances, had to include their squadrons in large groups of fighter aviation, close support aviation, and Allied bomber aviation. General Boscar, who headed our air force as a whole, Generals Valin, Gerardot, Montrelet, Lescher, and other commanders of individual units showed themselves worthy leaders of the French Air Army, ardently striving to restore its glory. Leading a completely new force, not yet having their own doctrines, they were able to use military technology with great skill and raise the morale of their men. In the front rank of commanders at this period of the revival of our armed forces were Generals Juin and de Lettre de Tassigny. They had the honour of alternately commanding the only army that France could put into battle. They appeared to have many things in common. They were of the same age, had received the same education, had entered the military at the same time, and were equally rapidly promoted. Both had avoided the traps set for them by the defeat of 1940 and then by the Vichy regime, and now took turns ceding to one another the important post of commander of the army, for which they had been created and which both had always dreamed of. However, they were magnanimous people, and despite their competition, appreciated each other, but what different natures they were. One, focused, always smooth, withdrawn, entirely given to the business, was obliged to his authority not only external brilliance, as much as deep merits, and attracted people more the impression of solidity which he produced rather than charm. Paving his way, he did not neglect sometimes cunning, but never resorted to unworthy tricks. Delattre, temperamental, agile, able to see far and look in all directions. He impressed by the strength of his mind and caused to himself love, as generously gave people his soul. He went to the goal set by sudden, unexpected, though often calculated leaps. In general, they were both masters of their craft. One, for each operation in advance, created a solid maneuver plan of action. In his calculations, he was guided by intelligence data and sometimes his own intuition, which later always confirmed the fact. The axis of his plans was always one single idea, so clear that it was always understood by his companions, so correct that he did not happen to change his intentions in the course of the fight, thought out so thoroughly that in the end the enemy had to submit to this plan. His successes were sometimes costly, but this was not to be condemned, and however great his merit in them, they seemed quite natural. Delattre, at every new position, first of all looked for an opportunity, and until he did not find this opportunity, he tried one thing, another, looking for groping, agonized, tormented by impatience, which expressed itself in sharp antics. But suddenly, having discovered where, when, and how the event he was looking for might occur, in order to cause and utilize it, he would use all the rich resources of his talent and extraordinary energy, demanding from those whom he was leading the utmost effort, but knowing how to inspire them with confidence of success. Just as Lamina, Leclerc and Koenig had done in the blackest years of France, and with weak forces, Juin and Delattre, as soon as the dawn dawned, launched the struggle on a wider, but, alas, still limited, and restored the honour of the French military command, in the eyes of the French nation, in the eyes of the Allies, and in the eyes of the enemy. Our expeditionary corps in Italy went into action in December 1943. If he was given a place in the fighting ranks, it was certainly for a difficult task. At that moment, the Allied forces, commanded by Alexander, were between Naples and Rome, coming into contact with the group of Field Marshal Kesselring, consisting of the 10th and 14th German armies. The front line stretched from the mouth of the Garigliano, that is, from the Mediterranean Sea to the mouth of the Rapido, flowing into the Adriatic Sea and passed through Monte Cassino. The Germans, who here turned out to have skillful and energetic commanders, occupied along the entire front line of a strongly fortified position, behind which they had two more fortified lines, Uster and Hitler. There were everywhere good troops, powerful guns, well-hidden field artillery, minefields. At the beginning of winter, the French zone of action was on the southern slopes of the Abruzzo Mountains, on the approaches to Acquafondata, among snow-covered, bare mountain ranges with rocky peaks and clay slopes, where we had to crawl through mud, drown in fog, and fight the sharp cold wind. Our troops, attached to the 5th American Army, stood on the right flank, connecting it with the 8th British Army. The object of the Allies was Rome. To approach it, General Clark, commander of the 5th Army, wanted to go to the Plain Leary, where it was convenient to advance his armoured units, but the access there was closed by a natural barrier, the ridge Cassino, and just on this ridge, that is, where the Germans were best fortified, Clark decided to force the enemy positions. True, he counted on his powerful artillery and even more on its aviation, which could, as he hoped, to suppress any resistance. The French Expeditionary Corps was tasked with breaking through the enemy's fortified line north of the famous monastery and helping the Allies to seize these positions. All through the second half of December, the 2nd Moroccan Division advanced with the greatest difficulty, being the first of our large military units to go into action, wading through mountains reaching 2,400 meters high, in snow or rain, fighting the enemy who fought fiercely. The division, which was commanded by Dodi, inch by inch seized the massifs of Castelnuovo, Pantano, Menade. To the south, our allies approached Monte Cassino. However, they failed to seize this area. In the north, the British Army remained in their positions. In January, Clark decided to strike a decisive blow with a joint effort, began an offensive along the entire front. At the same time, in Anzio landed a corps of Allied troops, wishing to bypass the enemy. Until mid-March, there were bloody battles, which, however, did not lead to a decisive outcome. There is no doubt that the French Expeditionary Corps, who did not spare their strength, suffered many trials and had on his account a lot of successes. In early January, General Juin took command of the corps. Next to the division of Dodi on the front line went to the 3rd North African Division of General de Monsaber and Moroccan troops of General Guillaume. They were later joined by the 4th Moroccan Division, commanded by Civez. In addition, the French sector was attached to the Italian division of General Utile. The offensive began on January 12. For 3 weeks, the French penetrated into the enemy zone to a depth of 20 kilometers, captured the front of the first line of German positions, then broke through the second line, took 1,200 prisoners, and the operations took place in the area extremely mountainous, and the enemy sent against our units more than a third of the forces that he put forward against the Fifth Army. The affair was crowned by the capture of Belvedere, which was the key point of the Gustav Line. In the battles for the mastery of this position, which changed hands several times, the 4th Tunisian Rifle Regiment performed one of the most brilliant military feats, but suffered heavy losses. In particular, Colonel Roux, the regimental commander, and 9 captains out of 24 were killed in battle. However, on the left flank in the hands of the enemy remained Monte Cassino. Despite the horrific bombardment from the air and repeated courageous attacks of the Americans, Indians, New Zealanders, on the right flank of the 8th Army did not notice significant progress. In such circumstances, Juin had to suspend its advance. And yet it gave the French the impression of victory. The enemy did not stop retreating in front of them. They felt that at their head is a commander with a clear mind and a strong will, whose plans are implemented exactly. The combined actions of different troops, the connection between the troops of different weapons left nothing to be desired. Finally, are convinced that in operations in mountainous terrain, requiring from the troops a huge strain of strength and maneuvering ability, no one in the camp of the Allies with them cannot be compared. In fact, the Allies themselves have been vocal about this. With what generosity and magnanimity King George VI Generals Eisenhower, Wilson, Alexander, and Clark expressed to General Juin and his troops their gratitude for their services. Early in March, when I inspected our troops on the Italian front and drove past those natural fortresses which they had taken, I, as well as all who were there, felt a sense of pride in our soldiers. But it became clear to me that a new effort could only be demanded of them as part of a broader strategy. And Juin was the first to be convinced of this. He had already made persistent representations to the Allied commanders about this, and soon proposed a new tactical plan to them. Juin believed that the mastery of Rome requires simultaneous coordinated actions of Allied forces, and, above all, the definition of the main blow to which everything must be subordinate. The blow must be struck in the area leading to the object, that is, in the strip south of the Abruzzese Mountains. Consequently, it is necessary to reduce the stretched front line of the Fifth Army, so that it can gather a strong fist at Garigliano, while the Eighth Army will extend its front to the south, and the units on its left flank will lead operations in the direction of Cassino and Liri. General Clark's zone would then have only 2 sectors, the Aurunci Mountains in the north and the plain adjacent to the sea in the south. The commander of the French Expeditionary Corps proposed to take the offensive on the Aurunci Mountains, while the Americans would advance on his left flank over less mountainous terrain. Before meeting ours, I decided to have a talk with Alexander and went to his headquarters, which was at Cassator. I felt that this man of bright mind and positive character was well suited to the role of commander of the Allied armed forces, a role of great difficulty, for he had to command the British Army, the American Army, part of the French Army, a corps of the Polish Army, Italian contingents, a Brazilian division, to direct his sensitive subordinates and bring them to mutual agreement. He had to negotiate with the headquarters of the naval armed forces of the various nations and their military aviation to bear patiently the instructions, inquiries, and demands for explanations from Washington and London, and yet be obliged to conduct a frontal offensive between the 2 seas, which severely limited the possibility of manoeuvre. General Alexander skillfully manoeuvred between all sorts of difficulties without losing his clarity of thought, courtesy, or optimism. He shared his plans with me. I listened to him without allowing myself to interfere with his operational plan. In my opinion, governments should give full freedom of thought to the commanders responsible for the outcome of a campaign. But when I heard from Alexander that he was contemplating a change in his strategy, and just in the sense recommended by Juin, I expressed my satisfaction. It turned out that Clark was inclined to make the same decision. I was in his van where he lived and worked. Clark made a very good impression on me, not only because he spoke clearly and concisely what he had to say, but also because, while holding a high command position, he remained a simple and humble man. In this he deserves a lot of credit, especially since he was the first American general to be given command of an army in the Western theatre of operations. America expects him to succeed. For his countrymen it is a matter of ego. As well as Alexander, Clark had the deepest respect for Yuan and spoke of the French troops with fervent and undoubtedly sincere praise. The same opinion of them was expressed by General Andes, commander of the Polish Corps, which occupied the sector adjacent to ours, and, encouraged by their hopes, performed miracles of bravery. The Italian General Utile and his division gave much appreciated assistance to our soldiers, and did so heartily. At Algiers, General Mascanguira, who came with his division from Brazil, which was soon afterward transferred to Italy, declared that he wished to take the French generals as models for himself. Truly, such words can soothe the pain of many wounds. Wilson soon notified me of the decision taken by General Alexander. The offensive was to be resumed in May, according to the plan shifted by Juin. Immediately we sent reinforcements to the Expeditionary Corps, sending to Italy on the first a Free French division, additional units of Moroccan troops, several artillery divisions, mating units and tanks. The Army Corps Command, having received the necessary replenishment, was now the Army Command. Now in North Africa, since the 2nd Armoured Division had been sent to England, only the following large troop units remained. 1st and 5th Armoured Divisions and the 9th Colonial Division, which was completing its training. We, therefore, put into action on the peninsula more than half of our combat forces. When General Wilson endeavoured to enthuse me with the prospect of increased hostilities on both shores of the Adriatic, and expressed the wish that we would give him an opportunity to use not only those French troops already in Italy, but also others in reserve, I replied that this was not at all the main object we had set for them, and that the French government intended to use both those and other troops for Operation Enville. Until then, I said to Wilson, our army in Italy, numbering 120,000 men, that is, more than a quarter of the total number of fighters, will take part in the next offensive, and I hope its role will be decisive. And so it came to pass. The offensive began on the night of May 112. The French Expeditionary Corps led the attack on the Urumqi Mountains. This chaotic pile of heights seemed to exclude any possibility of rapid advance, but that's why the French commanders launched military operations there. In fact, the enemy had every reason to believe that he should keep the defence mainly not in the mountains themselves, but on the northern or southern slopes, because they do not differ steep, and besides there are 2 roads to Rome. On the one hand road number 6 and on the other number 7. So we will take the enemy by surprise if we make the strongest attack in the most difficult sector. The extraordinary manoeuvre undertaken by General Juin in this sector stunned the enemy. On the highest ridge, where the least of the least walked paths and from where the Germans certainly did not expect an invasion, the French moved forward quickly, bypassing the right and left defences of the enemy, and one by one broke through all 3 lines of his positions, and so quickly that the Germans did not have time to remember, and none of the 3 lines did not repel, to take full advantage of the unexpected attack, fraught, of course, and great danger. The commander of the Expeditionary Corps gave the order to seize unawares in the dead of night, without prior artillery preparation of the slopes of Mount Maggio, a huge rampart that covered the entire system of German defensive positions. True, the Expeditionary Corps consisted of first-class troops adapted for mountain hikes. In particular, the 4th Division and Moroccan troops were able to pass anywhere, and General Juin was well aware of this, and so he entrusted to the combined forces of this division and Moroccan troops, under the command of Seves, an important task. As quickly as possible to cross the heights in this area, and, bypassing the south of the German location, move to the intended object, the Array Petrella near Pico, in the rear of the enemy. Excellent in its combat qualities regiment of the 2nd Moroccan Division, the 8th Rifle Regiment under the command of Colonel Maul was to break a gap in the enemy's defence, with a move to seize the height of Maggio. For its part, the 1st Free French Division, bypassing the mountainous massif from the north, will join the left flank of the 8th Army and help it to reach the Liri Plain. Finally, the 3rd North African and 2nd Moroccan Divisions were given the difficult task of seizing the German defences in the Urumqi Mountains themselves. It's like a living machine in which every cog is a thinking man striving for one single goal. The French army in Italy carried out exactly the orders of its commander. On May 17, when I came again to the peninsula, accompanied by the Minister of War, André Diethelm and Generals de la Trompeteur, I saw for myself on the spot, after years of humiliation and mental suffering, what a splendid picture was presented by the troops of Monsaber and Dodi advancing towards Esperia and San Olive, by the troops of Cervez and Giron, already on the approach to Pico, by the artillery batteries of Puerdenot, keeping pace with the infantry who were climbing the slopes, and by the sappers of Dromar, who on the eve of the assault had managed to perform a miracle. To build in close proximity to the enemy, but unheard and invisible to him bridges over the Garigliano, and now day and night worked tirelessly to ensure that our columns could safely pass through the roads, which the Germans had mined and cut. Our wagons moved in exemplary order. Our parks and workshops served the combat units without fail and without delay. In our mobile field hospitals, despite the large influx of wounded French and Germans, the state of medical service, the selfless work of our nurses of mercy and paramedics accompanying the ambulances, which were in charge of Madame Quatreau's and Madame du Luard, were at the height of the task, and everyone during the march at every post, whatever the losses and grueling ordeals, was ready for new trials and had the cheerful look peculiar to the Frenchman when things are going his way. On the 20th of May, all the German positions where we broke through to a depth of 36 kilometres, and the French had already passed over the Pico. On the left flank, the 2nd American Corps captured Fondi and was moving toward the Pontaine marshes. On the right flank of the British and Poles capture, some Angelo and others Monte Cassino. But in the sector where the enemy most concentrated defences, they were still fighting and had to stop before the line Atina, Pontecorvo, before they could reap the laurels of success. List by name the 5,000 German soldiers taken prisoner. Count the captured guns and all sorts of war material wrested from the enemy. The French Expeditionary Corps had to engage in new fighting and take the offensive along the Pontecorvo-Pico line, and on the left flank help General Lees to seize a new section in the direction of Rome. In June 4, our first units penetrated there. June 5, columns of American, British, French troops were already passing through the streets of the capital. German writer Rudolf Bommler, who himself fought in Italy, gave in his book Monte Cassino history of the battles of the 10th German Army. His book received the approval of Field Marshal Kesselring, describing the brilliant successes of the French Expeditionary Corps in the winter battles, in particular Ypres of Belvedere. The author recalls how concerned the German High Command was, having received a message that the French left this sector, and no one knew in what direction. And after all, the Germans foresaw that the Allied armies will make a new attempt to seize Rome. But only the enemy offensive, writes Rudolf Bommler, could reveal where we face the greatest danger. And its most accurate indicator has always been the location of the French Expeditionary Corps. Where has he moved? Where is it? Raduin appeared. Alexander was certainly up to something serious. And Kesselring knew it better than anyone. Most of all worries gave me that, said Field Marshal, that I did not know in what direction the French Expeditionary Corps will lead the attack, in the composition of what parts and where he thinks to strengthen. On this depended on my final decisions, Rudolf Bommler adds. The Field Marshal's fears had grounds. After all, it was Juin broke the left flank of the 10th Army and opened the Allies' road to Rome. Several months later, his Expeditionary Corps fought hard and finally cracked the gate that led to the Eternal City. Military valor, the honour of arms, feats of bravery of soldiers. Without them the country can neither resist the enemy nor recover after defeat. From time immemorial our nation has abundantly given the treasures of its courage in the service of the motherland, but for this it is necessary that its soul, its will, its actions, that is, its policy, should be national. Oh, if at the head of France between the two wars had stood an able public authority, if in the face of Hitler's ambitious designs she had been really governed, if the army that shielded her from the enemy had been properly equipped and commanded, very differently would have been our fate. Even after the defeat that befell us in May 1940, we would still have been assured of a significant role, for we still had our African possessions, we still had our navy, we still had part of the army. If only our regime had contributed to the significance of that role, and our leaders had strived for it. But after so many capitulations, France had to rise to the light from the gloom of a deep abyss, and for her everything depended on the efforts of her soldiers. After Keren, Bir Hashem, Fezzan, Tunis, the glory won by our troops in Italy gave France back hope of revival. Arriving in London on the eve of the big landing, I received a report on the operations of our troops in Italy and gave it to the commander. The French army made a significant contribution to the cause of the great victory won in Rome. It was meant to be so. It is your merit, General Juin. You and the troops subordinate to you are worthy of your homeland. There is no doubt that the French Expeditionary Corps, who did not spare their strength, suffered many trials and had on his account a lot of successes. In early January, General Juin took command of the corps. Next to the division of Dodi on the front line went to the 3rd North African Division of General de Monsaber and Moroccan troops of General Guillaume. They were later joined by the 4th Moroccan Division, commanded by Sives. In addition, the French sector was attached to the Italian division of General Utile. The offensive began on January 12. For 3 weeks, the French penetrated into the enemy zone to a depth of 20 kilometers, captured the front of the first line of German positions, then broke through the second line, took 1,200 prisoners, and the operations took place in the area extremely mountainous, and the enemy sent against our units more than a third of the forces that he put forward against the Fifth Army. The affair was crowned by the capture of Belvedere, which was the key point of the Gustav Line. In the battles for the mastery of this position, which changed hands several times, the 4th Tunisian Rifle Regiment performed one of the most brilliant military feats, but suffered heavy losses. In particular, Colonel Roux, the regimental commander, and 9 captains out of 24 were killed in battle. However, on the left flank in the hands of the enemy remained Monte Cassino. Despite the horrific bombardment from the air and repeated courageous attacks of the Americans, Indians, New Zealanders, on the right flank of the 8th Army did not notice significant progress. In such circumstances, Juin had to suspend its advance. And yet it gave the French the impression of victory. The enemy did not stop retreating in front of them. They felt that at their head is a commander with a clear mind and a strong will, whose plans are implemented exactly. The combined actions of different troops, the connection between the troops of different weapons left nothing to be desired. Finally, are convinced that in operations in mountainous terrain, requiring from the troops a huge strain of strength and maneuvering ability, no one in the camp of the Allies with them cannot be compared. In fact, the Allies themselves have been vocal about this. With what generosity and magnanimity King George VI Generals Eisenhower, Wilson, Alexander, and Clark expressed to General Juin and his troops their gratitude for their services. Early in March, when I inspected our troops on the Italian front and drove past those natural fortresses which they had taken, I, as well as all who were there, felt a sense of pride in our soldiers. But it became clear to me that a new effort could only be demanded of them as part of a broader strategy. And Juin was the first to be convinced of this. He had already made persistent representations to the Allied commanders about this, and soon proposed a new tactical plan to them. Juin believed that the mastery of Rome requires simultaneous coordinated actions of Allied forces, and, above all, the definition of the main blow to which everything must be subordinate. The blow must be struck in the area leading to the object, that is, in the strip south of the Abruzes Mountains. Consequently, it is necessary to reduce the stretched front line of the Fifth Army, so that it can gather a strong fist at Garigliano, while the 8th Army will extend its front to the south, and the units on its left flank will lead operations in the direction of Cassino and Liri. General Clark's zone would then have only 2 sectors, the Aurunci Mountains in the north and the plain adjacent to the sea in the south. The commander of the French Expeditionary Corps proposed to take the offensive on the Aurunci Mountains, while the Americans would advance on his left flank over less mountainous terrain. Before meeting ours, I decided to have a talk with Alexander and went to his headquarters, which was at Cassator. I felt that this man of bright mind and positive character was well suited to the role of commander of the Allied armed forces, a role of great difficulty, for he had to command the British Army, the American Army, part of the French Army, a corps of the Polish Army, Italian contingents, a Brazilian division, to direct his sensitive subordinates and bring them to mutual agreement. He had to negotiate with the headquarters of the naval armed forces of the various nations and their military aviation to bear patiently the instructions, inquiries, and demands for explanations from Washington and London, and yet be obliged to conduct a frontal offensive between the 2 seas, which severely limited the possibility of manoeuvre. General Alexander skillfully manoeuvred between all sorts of difficulties without losing his clarity of thought, courtesy, or optimism. He shared his plans with me. I listened to him without allowing myself to interfere with his operational plan. In my opinion, governments should give full freedom of thought to the commanders responsible for the outcome of a campaign. But when I heard from Alexander that he was contemplating a change in his strategy, and just in the sense recommended by Juin, I expressed my satisfaction. It turned out that Clark was inclined to make the same decision. I was in his van where he lived and worked. Clark made a very good impression on me, not only because he spoke clearly and concisely what he had to say, but also because, while holding a high command position, he remained a simple and humble man. In this he deserves a lot of credit, especially since he was the first American general to be given command of an army in the Western theatre of operations. America expects him to succeed. For his countrymen it is a matter of ego. As well as Alexander, Clark had the deepest respect for Yuan and spoke of the French troops with fervent and undoubtedly sincere praise. The same opinion of them was expressed by General Andes, commander of the Polish Corps, which occupied the sector adjacent to ours, and, encouraged by their hopes, performed miracles of bravery. The Italian General Utile and his division gave much appreciated assistance to our soldiers, and did so heartily. At Algiers, General Mascanguira, who came with his division from Brazil, which was soon afterward transferred to Italy, declared that he wished to take the French generals as models for himself. Truly, such words can soothe the pain of many wounds. Wilson soon notified me of the decision taken by General Alexander. The offensive was to be resumed in May, according to the plan shifted by Juin. Immediately we sent reinforcements to the Expeditionary Corps, sending to Italy on the first a Free French division, additional units of Moroccan troops, several artillery divisions, mating units and tanks. The Army Corps Command, having received the necessary replenishment, was now the Army Command. Now in North Africa, since the 2nd Armoured Division had been sent to England, only the following large troop units remained. 1st and 5th Armoured Divisions and the 9th Colonial Division, which was completing its training. We, therefore, put into action on the peninsula more than half of our combat forces. When General Wilson endeavoured to enthuse me with the prospect of increased hostilities on both shores of the Adriatic, and expressed the wish that we would give him an opportunity to use not only those French troops already in Italy, but also others in reserve, I replied that this was not at all the main object we had set for them, and that the French government intended to use both those and other troops for Operation Enville. Until then, I said to Wilson, our army in Italy, numbering 120,000 men, that is, more than a quarter of the total number of fighters, will take part in the next offensive, and, I hope, its role will be decisive. And so it came to pass. The offensive began on the night of May 112. The French Expeditionary Corps led the attack on the Urumqi Mountains. This chaotic pile of heights seemed to exclude any possibility of rapid advance, but that's why the French commanders launched military operations there. In fact, the enemy had every reason to believe that he should keep the defence mainly not in the mountains themselves, but on the northern or southern slopes, because they do not differ steep, and besides there are 2 roads to Rome. On the one hand road number 6 and on the other number 7. So we will take the enemy by surprise if we make the strongest attack in the most difficult sector. The extraordinary manoeuvre undertaken by General Juin in this sector stunned the enemy. On the highest ridge, where the least of the least walked paths and from where the Germans certainly did not expect an invasion, the French moved forward quickly, bypassing the right and left defences of the enemy, and one by one broke through all 3 lines of his positions, and so quickly that the Germans did not have time to remember, and none of the 3 lines did not repel. To take full advantage of the unexpected attack, fraught, of course, and great danger, the commander of the Expeditionary Corps gave the order to seize unawares in the dead of night, without prior artillery preparation of the slopes of Mount Maggio, a huge rampart that covered the entire system of German defensive positions. True, the Expeditionary Corps consisted of first-class troops adapted for mountain hikes. In particular, the 4th Division and Moroccan troops were able to pass anywhere, and General Juin was well aware of this, and so he entrusted to the combined forces of this division and Moroccan troops, under the command of Seves, an important task. As quickly as possible to cross the heights in this area, and, bypassing the south of the German location, move to the intended object, the Array Petrella near Pico, in the rear of the enemy. Excellent in its combat qualities regiment of the 2nd Moroccan Division, The 8th Rifle Regiment, under the command of Colonel Maul, was to break a gap in the enemy's defence, with a move to seize the height of Maggio. For its part, the 1st Free French Division, bypassing the mountainous massif from the north, will join the left flank of the 8th Army and help it to reach the Liri Plain. Finally, the 3rd North African and 2nd Moroccan Divisions were given the difficult task of seizing the German defences in the Aurunchi Mountains themselves. It's like a living machine in which every cog is a thinking man striving for one single goal. The French army in Italy carried out exactly the orders of its commander. On May 17, when I came again to the peninsula, accompanied by the Minister of War, André Diethelm, and Generals de Lattre and Bitourde, I saw for myself on the spot, after years of humiliation and mental suffering, what a splendid picture was presented by the troops of Monsaber and Dodi advancing towards Esperia and San Olive, by the troops of Cévez and Giron, already on the approach to Pico, by the artillery batteries of Puerdenot, keeping pace with the infantry who were climbing the slopes, and by the sappers of Dromar, who on the eve of the assault had managed to perform a miracle. To build in close proximity to the enemy, but unheard and invisible to him, bridges over the Garigliano, and now day and night worked tirelessly to ensure that our columns could safely pass through the roads, which the Germans had mined and cut. Our wagons moved in exemplary order. Our parks and workshops served the combat units without fail and without delay. In our mobile field hospitals, despite the large influx of wounded French and Germans, the state of medical service, the selfless work of our nurses of mercy and paramedics accompanying the ambulances, which were in charge of Madame Quatreaus and Madame du Lourdes, were at the height of the task, and everyone during the march at every post, whatever the losses and gruelling ordeals, was ready for new trials and had the cheerful look peculiar to the Frenchman when things are going his way. On the 20th of May, all the German positions where we broke through to a depth of 36 kilometres, and the French had already passed over the Pico. On the left flank, the 2nd American Corps captured Fondi and was moving toward the Pontaine marshes. On the right flank of the British and Poles capture, some Angelo and others Monte Cassino. But in the sector where the enemy most concentrated defences, they were still fighting and had to stop before the line Atina, Pontecorvo, before they could reap the laurels of success. List by name the 5,000 German soldiers taken prisoner. Count the captured guns and all sorts of war material wrested from the enemy. The French Expeditionary Corps had to engage in new fighting and take the offensive along the Pontecorvo-Pico line, and on the left flank help General Lees to seize a new section in the direction of Rome. In June 4, our first units penetrated there. June 5, columns of American, British, French troops were already passing through the streets of the capital. German writer Rudolf Bommler, who himself fought in Italy, gave in his book Monte Cassino history of the battles of the 10th German Army. His book received the approval of Field Marshal Kesselring, describing the brilliant successes of the French Expeditionary Corps in the winter battles, in particular Ypres of Belvedere. The author recalls how concerned the German High Command was, having received a message that the French left this sector, and no one knew in what direction. And after all, the Germans foresaw that the Allied armies will make a new attempt to seize Rome. But only the enemy offensive, writes Rudolf Bommler, could reveal where we face the greatest danger. And its most accurate indicator has always been the location of the French Expeditionary Corps. Where has he moved? Where is it? Raduin appeared. Alexander was certainly up to something serious. And Kesselring knew it better than anyone. Most of all worries gave me that, said Field Marshal, that I did not know in what direction the French Expeditionary Corps will lead the attack, in the composition of what parts and where he thinks to strengthen. On this depended on my final decisions, Rudolf Bommler adds. The Field Marshal's fears had grounds. After all, it was Juin broke the left flank of the 10th Army and opened the Allies' road to Rome. Several months later, his Expeditionary Corps fought hard and finally cracked the gate that led to the Eternal City. Military valor, the honour of arms, feats of bravery of soldiers. Without them the country can neither resist the enemy nor recover after defeat. From time immemorial our nation has abundantly given the treasures of its courage in the service of the motherland, but for this it is necessary that its soul, its will, its actions, that is, its policy, should be national. Oh, if at the head of France between the two wars had stood an able public authority, if in the face of Hitler's ambitious designs she had been really governed, if the army that shielded her from the enemy had been properly equipped and commanded, very differently would have been our fate. Even after the defeat that befell us in May 1940, we would still have been assured of a significant role, for we still had our African possessions, we still had our navy, we still had part of the army. If only our regime had contributed to the significance of that role and our leaders had strived for it. But after so many capitulations, France had to rise to the light from the gloom of a deep abyss, and for her everything depended on the efforts of her soldiers. After Keren, Bir Hashim, Fezzan, Tunis, the glory won by our troops in Italy gave France back hope of revival. Arriving in London on the eve of the big landing, I received a report on the operations of our troops in Italy and gave it to the commander. The French army made a significant contribution to the cause of the great victory won in Rome. It was meant to be so. It is your merit, General Juin. You and the troops subordinate to you are worthy of your homeland. While the 2nd and 4th Divisions and Moroccan units halted near Rome to regroup, Juin threw a corps under General Lamin in his sector to pursue the enemy. This corps, formed from the divisions of Brosset and de Mansaber, reinforced with tanks and artillery, moved in the direction of Lake Bolsena, Radicofani, Orsia Pass. At each of these points were heavy fighting, in which fell many brave soldiers, and with them died Colonel Liran Champros and Captain 2nd Rank Amiot Dinville, of whom the first commanded artillery and the second, a regiment of Marines of the 1st Free French Division. Still, Lamina dealt properly with the German rearguard. It must be said that the Allied aviation dominated the air and crushed the enemy columns. Nothing so well gave an idea of the defeat of the Germans as piles of scrap iron rising along the roads. And then the French took possession of the island of Elba, supported by special ships, which gave them the British and several American fighter and bomber squadrons. This operation was proposed by General Giraud immediately after the liberation of Corsica, but the Allies were then absorbed in military action in Anzio, and he could not convince them of the feasibility of his plan. Now they themselves have asked us to take the island. The attack was led under the command of General Henry Martin, 9th Colonial Division, a shock battalion and paratroopers. All these units stood in Africa and were to enter the Armée de l'Être in the upcoming soon landing of Allied troops in southern France. On the night of June 1617, General Martin's small groups landed shock troops of Major Gambiers, and they within minutes seized 7 batteries of the Germans. Then the division of Magnan stepped ashore in the Bay of Campo. On June 18, after heavy fighting at Marina di Campo, Porto Longone, Portoferraio, our troops occupied the whole island, destroying the German garrison, commanded by General Gall. They captured 2,300 prisoners, took possession of 60 guns and much military property. General Delattre, who immediately arrived on the scene, informed me the same evening by telegraph from Napoleon's cabin of the results, emphasizing that this victory was achieved on the anniversary of my enlistment 1940. The occupation of the island could be considered a good beginning of the great operation I dreamed of at that time, when I addressed the proclamation and had in mind a landing on the coast of Provence. But everything depended on the final decisions of the Allies. After all, they can be impressed by the magnitude of the victories achieved in Italy at the last minute to abandon the Operation Envol in favor of a completely different plan. The consolidation of success on the peninsula during my trip, undertaken at the end of June, after my return from London and Bayeux, I found that the commanders were indeed very anxious to continue the campaign with the forces that were in place, and even to extend it with the support of new reinforcements. Such a desire was quite natural to them. I, on the other hand, in view of my responsibility to the French nation, could not accept such an accurate view. Meanwhile, the Americans, who were fighting fierce battles in Normandy, demanded an early landing in Provence. Marshall and Eisenhower insisted that it should take place in August. For greater certainty, I, for my part, brought to the attention of Generals Wilson and Alexander that the French government specifically request them in due course to regroup the French armed forces placed at their disposal so that they would be transferred to France in August at the latest. I had no objection to our troops, busy in pursuit of the enemy, continuing the operations begun for a few weeks longer. But they should in no way be engaged in fighting after July 25, nor should they cross the Arno Valley. To our armies in Italy, as well as to our forces in readiness in Africa, I have given orders determining their future objective. General Juin. However sad it was for him to leave his post, and however painful it was for me to deprive him of it, I appointed him Chief of the General Staff of National Defence. a post of particular importance at a time of active operations, of serious reorganization of the army, and of friction with the Allies which would inevitably arise in the liberation of the country. Up to the day I left power, Juin was with me as one of the best aides and most loyal military advisers that ever had the head of France. At last the date of the landing in the south was fixed for August 15. As we wanted, all French land, naval and air forces in the Mediterranean Sea area was to participate in this operation. Until then, some of our units remained on the Italian peninsula, continuing the advance at the head of the divisions of Munseba and Dodi, as well as Moroccan units. General de la Mina July 3 seized Siena, taking, however, all necessary measures not to destroy this wonderful city. On July 22, our troops, under the immediate command of Duane, who wished to direct the last battles in Italy himself, captured Castelfiorentino near Florence and the Arno Valley, where the enemy would afterwards at length gather strength. Then, having entrusted their sector to the care of the Allies, ours hastened to board the ships which were to land them in France. They had to go by sea, where the Western Fleet dominated. True, back in September 1943, after the armistice in Syracuse, the Axis powers were deprived of almost the entire Italian fleet, already suffered a lot from the raids of Andrew Cunningham. On the other hand, in the spring of 1944, the British were destroyed Scharnhorst and Tirpitz, the last fast ships of the German fleet. Nevertheless, the enemy still had a lot of submarines, raiders, bottom patrol vessels, which, acting in conjunction with aviation, continued to inflict heavy losses to the caravans of our ships. Therefore, it was necessary to first clear the seas of the enemy and then already release the Armada, which will carry troops for landing. Accordingly, in the Atlantic, in the North Sea, in the Arctic Ocean, French cruisers, destroyers, submarines, frigates, corvettes, sea hunters, patrolling patrol vessels, convoy ships, departing from British ports, under the command of Admiral d'Argentieu, took part in an extensive plan of offensive and defensive operations conducted by the Allies. During Operation Overlord, all of our ships based in England, 40 small warships and 50 steamers and freighters, participated in escorting and transporting ground troops and in shelling the enemy during General Eisenhower's landing. The cruisers Georges Lake and Montcalm, under Admiral Jojar, took part in this operation. Stopping at Port-en-Bessin, they shelled the coast extremely effectively and then supported the landing of troops. To the old battleship Corbett, which for 4 years had stood as a pontoon in the roadstead at Portsmouth, a small crew, headed by the good Commander Witzel, was sent under these extraordinary circumstances, who, under the fire of the enemy, brought the battleship close to the French shore and grounded it there. The result was the formation of a sort of breakwater and the creation of the artificial port of Aromanches. Finally, the Marines under Lieutenant Commander Kiffey went ashore at Windstream with the first Allied detachments. In the South Atlantic, the French fleet, in anticipation of Operation Enville, was intensely supporting the actions of the Western powers. 7 of our cruisers, divided into 2 detachments under the command respectively of Admirals Longo and Barter, which were soon joined by 2 cruisers of Admiral Jojar, carried between Dickard and Natal service to intercept German ships, carrying out blockades. One of the enemy's vessels, the Portland, was sunk by the Georges Legomp. Along the entire west coast of Africa, and in general at these latitudes, naval forces and naval aviation under the command of Admiral Collinet conducted operations against submarines, raiders and enemy aircraft. In the Mediterranean Sea detachment of light French cruisers, under the command of Captain First Rank Sala, who was later replaced by Lancelot, along with numerous British and American ships, supported the Allied armies in Italy. Thus, in September 1943, Fantasque and Terrible took part in the landing of troops near Salerno. In January 1944, Fantasque and Milan helped in the operation in Anzio, firing at close-range German reinforcements marching along the Appian Way. Then, going out into the Adriatic Sea, this detachment attacked the ships that the enemy spent the night along the Italian coast to bring food to their troops deprived of land supply, thanks to the actions of the Allied Air Force. On March 1, in the vicinity of Pola, our light cruisers launched 5 enemy vessels, including 1 destroyer. On March 19, they sank 5 ships far out to sea. In June, in the northern Adriatic, they destroyed 4 more ships. During this period, all caravans of friendly powers, sailing in the latitude of England and Normandy, or headed for Italy, Corsica, North Africa, had in their escort French ships. We lost the destroyer combatant submarine Prote, Vest Ship Arden, Minesweeper Marie Mudd, Tanker Nivos, Sea Hunter No. 5 and several cargo ships. Finally, in the Pacific, the magnificent Richelieu, under the command of Mervale du Vignaux, joined the ships of the line fleet. In April at Maban, in May at Surabaya, he actively supported the actions of Allied aircraft carriers. In short, the French fleet everywhere showed themselves the best way. If the dominance of the sea and allowed to undertake an offensive on the continent, then only because it was combined with the predominance of the air. And in those and other operations, the French took an active part, although they did not play a decisive role. 17 of our air groups supported ground troops in Italy. 7 air groups participated in the Battle of France. 2 of them flew long-range bombing aimed at disabling German industry. 2 fighter air groups honorably participated in the fierce struggle, which was won by Russia. Several air groups covered land bases on the coast of North Africa and caravans of ships at sea. Their glorious deeds and feats were like sparks that ignited the fire of the great battle. The Battle of France merges into a unified whole. The fighting spirit which inspires our regular troops is also growing in our inland forces. These latter, long before the landing begins, are no longer merely engaged in skirmishes, but are fighting serious battles all over the form. To the reports of the operations of ground troops, Lot and Air Force, are now joined daily reports of the activity of the Maquis and the underground. It is only natural that the conflagration covers above all the Central Massif, Limousin and the Alps. On September 10, 1943, a battle breaks out near Dersch in Aveyron, which was a signal of sorts. A whole company of Germans retreated under the onslaught of ours, leaving on the battlefield of his captain and 10 soldiers. It is true that at La Bourrière, the victorious partisans were in turn exterminated and their commander, Lieutenant de Requemorel, killed by the enemy. But elsewhere in the Aveyron and Cantal battles are being fought in which the advantage remains on our side. At Saint Ferréol, at Terrasson, fierce skirmishes are taking place, in the course of which the occupiers are losing several hundred men. These are the forerunners of the great operation which will be carried out simultaneously with the landing. At Puy de Dôme, after several successful sorties, Colonel Gary gathered 3,000 men to Muchette position, and on June 2 began fighting, in which the Germans were at a distinct disadvantage. Continuous fighting in Limousin, Curzy, Périgord caused the enemy serious losses. In the Upper Savoy unfolds more and more intense fighting. Already in June 1943, the Italians who occupied this department had quite a hard time in Dain-de-Lanthorn and the next month. In Cluses, the Germans who replaced them were repeatedly attacked during the winter. In February, 500 Frenchmen, joined by 60 Spaniards, took up a position on the plateau of Glayas. They were commanded by Lieutenant Morel. After Morel's death, he was replaced by Captain Anjord, who in turn fell on the battlefield. The enemy, who throughout March repeatedly undertook against them forays, ending in failure, decided to launch a large force. He threw against them 3 battalions, 2 mountain batteries, heavy mortars, with the disgusting help of detachments of French militia and gendarmerie. So 7,000 men, supported by dive bombers, come forward to assault the plateau of Glayas. After 13 days of fighting, the Germans finally managed to capture it. In doing so, they lost 600 of their soldiers and still could not destroy the defenders, 2/3 of whom managed to escape from the pursuers. In the department of Aisne there is continuous fighting. The detachments of the internal forces, disciplined, led by experienced commanders, are masters of the situation here. They prove it on November 11, the day of the glorious Jubilee, by taking Oyonnax in one day. After entering the town, Colonel Roman Petit inspects the troops in front of the monument to the dead, and then the soldiers march through the town, greeted by the rejoicing population. In order to destroy the poppies in Iran, the Germans carry out serious operations in early 1944, which cost them several hundred soldiers. In April, they make new attempts, for which they pay an even more expensive price. In June, ours begin offensives everywhere and capture 400 Germans. In the department of Drôme, through which passes the great Lyons-Marseilles transportation line, as well as the routes to Grenoble and to Baranson, Colonel Drout's Maquis operate chiefly on the railroad tracks. In December, a train carrying German vacationers to Port-les-Valence blows up. The cars, partly stopped, partly overturned, are machine-gunned, with the result that 200 soldiers are killed and 200 wounded by ours. A few days later, a troop train derails at Vercheny and falls into the Drôme. In March, in the Danzig Gorge, partisans stopped and shelled a military wagon, leaving 300 dead and wounded at the site of the skirmish. A short time later, an armed group attacked near Cedron, fights to the last man. At Drome, however, everything is in readiness to cut the enemy's railroad communications when the great battle begins. In the Department of Iser, our internal forces intend to commence extensive operations as soon as the fighting breaks out. Their preparatory operations are costing the enemy much. At Grenoble, for example, on November 14, the resistance forces blew up an artillery park where the Germans had stored ammunition, fuel, and transports. The Germans arrested 300 hostages. They refused to release them. And then, as a sanction, the barracks in Beaune, where several Wehrmacht batteries were located, was destroyed by explosions, killing 220 Germans and wounding 550. At the same time, the resistance fighters under Major Leray, following the instructions of General de Lestrade and the orders of Colonel Decourt, who commanded our forces in the Iser, made their way into the Vercors Massif and entrenched themselves there. The enemy's reconnaissance detachments cannot even come close to Vercors. These are perhaps the most significant operations carried out by the resistance forces during this period. At any rate, the most significant of those described in the reports. However, many other things were also done during this time, not so significant and not so concerning. It is enough to leaf through the short reports, in which the place of action is indicated by numbers. Orders and messages are transmitted in coded phrases, and soldiers are designated by various outlandish nicknames, to realize how effective this internal warfare is. And the enemy confirms this by resorting to the most brutal reprisals. Even before the Allied armies set foot on our soil, the German has already lost thousands of his soldiers from us. He is surrounded by an atmosphere of uncertainty, which affects the morale of the troops and disorients the commanders. In addition, the local authorities and the French police, whether because they genuinely sympathize with the resistance or because they fear the sanctions that could fall on collaborators, do not so much encourage as discourage repression. Add to this the fact that Germans, even when they are not being shot in the back or blown up by underground grenades, live with the feeling that they are being watched everywhere. Nothing of the actions of the occupiers escapes our underground fighters. Not without reason, General Bedell Smith wrote in his report, "In May, from France to London received 700 messages by telegraph and 3,000 written reports." Indeed, on the day the battle began, we knew exactly the location of German troops, their bases, depots, airfields, command posts. The personnel of their troops and material were accurately accounted for, defences photographed, minefields marked. Between the headquarters of Koenig and the underground, there was a well-established radio communication, which allowed to immediately respond to inquiries and send reports. Thanks to the full range of information received from the French resistance, the Allies saw through the enemy's game and could strike for sure. The news of the landing was a signal for the Maquis to take action everywhere. I had foreseen this in advance, and as early as May 16, transmitted an order to the internal forces in the form of the so-called Cayman Plan, specifying the objectives that they should try to achieve. However, the Allied command was not without misgivings about the expansion of guerrilla action. Moreover, it foresaw prolonged fighting. Therefore, it wanted the resistance forces to take their time and only become active on the approaches to the battles for the pre-bridge fort. In his address to the French patriots on the radio on June 6, General Eisenhower asked them to keep a wait-and-see tactic. It is true that on the same day I urged them, on the contrary, to fight with all means at their disposal, in accordance with the orders of the French command. But the supply of weapons depends on the Allied General Staff and is initially made in very limited amounts. Joint Staff is interested in the destruction of railroads, highways, means of communication, which he considers a matter of paramount importance. Railroad facilities are divided between aviation and resistance forces. These latter take over the most remote areas, Lyrien, Dijon, Dieu, East, Centre, Southwest, where in June and July derailed 600 trains. In addition, our take on the organization of sabotage on all railroads, resulting in the disabling of 1,800 steam locomotives and over 6,000 cars. As a result of skillfully carried out destructive work on June 6 and the following days, the underground telegraph cables used by the enemy for communication between Normandy and the Paris area were damaged. The wire communication in general was cut without end. One can imagine the confusion which such disruptions of communication and transportation are causing in the German camp, especially as at this very moment armed demonstrations are beginning in a number of departments, which are having a considerable effect on the course of operations. As a result of all this, the High Command was forced to recognize the value of the services rendered by the partisans and gave them assistance, not too generous but still quite effective. In regard to Brittany, however, the Allies are not at all wait-and-see tactics. General Eisenhower wants the Armorican Peninsula to be cleared of German hordes before he moves his armies to the scene, and Brittany is full of guerrillas, especially in the departments of Côtes du Nord and Morbihan, where the terrain is extremely favourable to their actions. So it was decided to give arms to the Bretons and send there the 1st Parachute Regiment, standing in England ready under the command of Colonel Burgoyne. On the eve of the landing and during the following days in the location of our internal forces, fell from the sky many containers and whole groups of parachutists, and the resistance immediately flared up. Some 1,000 people are included in the campaign. Some united in troop units, others in small combat groups to perform individual tasks. However, the Germans detected in Saint-Marcel, near Maltreux, one of the bases where ours received weapons arriving from England, and June 18 attacked her. It was defended by a battalion of Morbians, several detachments of parachutists under Major Legaric, and a company under retired General de la Mole, which he himself had formed at Jengan. After a battle lasting several hours, the enemy succeeded in occupying the base, which was strewn with corpses. However, the surviving defenders still managed to evade their pursuers. The news of the fighting in Saint-Marcel finally shook the whole of Brittany. The invaders are being blockaded in urban centres and ports. They fight desperately and spare no one, but the Bretons give them no respite and attack from everywhere. And like yeast that causes fermentation in dough, Colonel Burgoyne and his men act in Brittany. In the 1st Parachute Regiment, out of 45 officers, there are 23 killed when Patton's tanks, having broken through the gap at Avranches, entered Brittany in early August. They found ours everywhere, who had already managed to bury 1,800 German corpses and take 3,000 Germans prisoner. Later, when the campaign to eliminate garrisons began, the partisans served as excellent guides for American tanks and accompanied the infantry. The enemy resists only in the ports of Saint-Malo, Brest, Lorient, where he has organized defenses in advance. Several thousand killed, about 50,000 prisoners, as well as a significant amount of lost equipment. 4 German divisions are destroyed. On the other side of the country, in the neighbourhood of Vercors, the fighting provides similar evidence of the effectiveness of the French resistance from a military point of view. In the first days of June, 3,000 men settled in this mountain range, since the terrain here is extremely rugged and can be defended only in separate groups. As do the guerrillas, and the inhabitants of the Alps are very determined, managed to convince the Allied command to provide them with substantial assistance with weapons. They dropped by parachute 1,500 containers. A mission of American, British and French officers leaves England for Vercors to maintain communication between the garrison and the main command. Several instructors and specialists from Algeria arrived to join the guerrillas, in coordination with the Allied Air Force in the centre of the Massif. A landing ground is arranged to receive detachments of regular troops, to bring in supplies and ammunition and evacuate the wounded. On July 14th, the enemy goes on the offensive. 10 days the attack lasts. Significant forces are thrown into the battle. From airplanes, our machine gun defenders and rare settlements are bombed. Since the German fighters control the air all these days, the Allied Air Force refuses to fly out on the grounds that because of the distance it is supposedly impossible to provide transport planes and bombers proper fighter support. More than that, the landing site, which the defenders arranged in expectation of the arrival of reinforcements, falls into the hands of the enemy, who landed there in gliders several select detachments. Nevertheless, the guerrillas, fighting with amazing persistence, until July 24, held back the onslaught of attackers. And on that day, the Germans occupy Vercors. They held there almost an entire division and lost several thousand aged. They killed the wounded and killed the inhabitants of the surrounding villages. At Vassia, they wiped out the entire population of the town. Half of the Alpine riflemen operating in Vercors gave their lives for France. The other half managed to retreat. These battles became widely known throughout the world. Naturally, the radio of Algiers, London and New York gave them much attention. In the middle of July, 40 departments were already in revolt. The departments of the massive central Limousin, the Alps, as well as those of Haute-Garonne, Dordogne, Drôme and Jura, and those of Brittany, were in the hands of the Marquis, belonging to the secret army or to the frontier partisans, to the aura or to guerrilla units. The prefects, in one way or another, get in touch with the resistance. The prefects of liberation openly appear. The municipalities of 1940 resume their activities. Wherever they are, reconvened. The cross of Lorraine appears on people's chests, on walls, on the flags adorning public buildings. As for the Germans, they are surrounded, exhausted, cut-off garrisons live in a state of incessant anxiety. Single Germans are either killed or taken prisoner, and the enemy columns cannot make a step so as not to clash with ours. The enemy responds with massacres and arson, as for example in Oradour-sur-Glane, Thule, Sedan, etc. And so, while in Normandy the Germans have to fight increasingly heavy battles in most of France, their situation becomes quite desperate. At the end of July, French internal forces are pinned down by 8 enemy divisions, none of which can be released and sent to reinforcements at the front. The 1st Infantry Division and the 5th Parachute Division are stuck in Brittany. The 175th Division in Anjou and Touraine, the 116th Armoured Division in the Paris area, the so-called Ostlegion Division in the Massif Central, the 181st Division in Toulouse, the 172nd Division in Bordeaux, and about an entire division from the army stationed in Provence, guarding the Rhône Valley. More to the point, the 3 armoured divisions which the German command urgently summons to Normandy to throw them into battle in 48 hours arrive there with great delay. The 17th Armoured Division, which our troops intercept between Bordeaux and Poitiers, loses 10 days before its columns manage to get through. The 2nd SS Armoured Division, the so-called Reich, which left Montauban on June 6, is forced to abandon movement by rail, because all the tracks are out of service. Some of its units get stuck in Tarn, Low, Corrèze, Haut, Vienne, and only on June 18, exhausted, having suffered heavy losses. It arrives at last at Alençon. The 11th Armoured Division, which took only 8 days to cross from the Russian front to the French border by rail, spends 23 days to cross France and from Strasbourg to Caen. And what damage? Material and moral suffered by German units from the endless troubles befalling the wagons, from the disruption of communications and supplies. All this made it appear that the enemy's rearguard, whose duty it was to defend the Mediterranean coast, would hardly hold out as soon as the French and Americans landed in Provence. I was informed of this by Colonel Henry Zeller, our military delegate to the southeast, who came from France early in August. He claims that it is worth our troops to take Toulon and Marseilles, and they will quickly be able to overcome the lines of defence that the enemy will create on the Rhône, since the area of the Alps and the Massif Central is in the hands of our internal forces. Zeller has communicated this to Generals Patch and Delattre, to whom I've referred him. These latter accordingly changing the previously intended tempo of their advance. The development of events confirms the correctness of Zeller's assumption. Brion Command was supposed to occupy only after 2 months of fighting, and he was in our hands 17 days after the landing. The upsurge that in France and Africa encourages the French to take up arms inevitably affects the situation in Indochina. In Saigon and Hanoi, we're still waiting for a sudden powerful blow from the invaders. Now, as elsewhere, no longer doubt the ultimate victory of the Allies. Not only are there signs of Germany's collapse, but Japan is beginning to give up her position. Not only that in the summer of 1943, the further advance of the Japanese Navy and Japanese armies was generally suspended. Now the initiative has passed into the hands of the Allies. Admiral Nimitz Aptevatund after Island in the Central Pacific, General MacArthur is moving towards the Philippines. Lord Mountbatten, with the help of Chiang Kai-shek's troops, landed in Burma. That is why some of the representatives of the French authorities in Indochina are slowly turning towards the Algerian government. The director of the bank, François, who has arrived from Saigon, announces this. Governor-General de Boisanger, the chief of the political chancellery, takes cautious steps to contact General Peshkov, our ambassador in Chongqing. General Morden, the commander of the troops, enters into secret negotiations with Colonel Tutange, the chief of the intelligence service, who is in Yunnan on our behalf. I believe that the urgent task must be to join our troops in military operations in the Far East. The idea that it is possible to preserve the former possessions of France by adhering to a benevolent passivity toward the Japanese to the end seems to me outrageous and ridiculous. I had no doubt at all that in the current strategic situation, when Indochina was in the center of the enemy's location, the latter everywhere pressed, forced to retreat, inevitably try to save themselves from the risk of unnecessary fighting on the peninsula. But failing on the nearby battlefields, can he tolerate the presence of a French army of 50,000 men among his troops, especially when the fiction of neutrality of France collapsed with Vichy? In short, everything makes one think that the day will come when the Japanese will want to liquidate the French troops and the French administration, even supposing that with humiliating guarantees they could leave some part of our troops and some crumbs of our power intact. It is inconceivable that the states and peoples of the Federation, on the one hand, and the Allies, on the other, would agree to the restoration of French domination in an area where we had not taken any part in the world struggle. Consequently, we had before us the task of preparing armed resistance to the enemy on the peninsula, so that he could not take possession of our posts without a fight, expel our representatives from the country, and utterly trample on our dignity. We should send troops to the Far East who could enter Indochina as soon as the opportunity presented itself. In my letter of February 29, 1944, to General Mordan, I tried to strengthen him in his good intentions and clarified what the government expected from him and from his soldiers in the extremely difficult situation in which he found himself. Some time later, I appointed General Bizot to command the troops destined for the Far East. But since these troops could only begin operations from India, Burma, or China, their dispatch required the consent of the Allies. And Washington, London, and Chongqing were not in a hurry to respond. Nevertheless, we obtained the permission of the British government and Lord Mountbatten, Commander-in-Chief in the Indian Ocean area, that General Bizot to come to Delhi and there to make preparations for further action, along with the general departs and echelon of our troops. This is the first step towards the goal. But deep down we know very well that the problem of Indochina, as well as the whole future of France, will be decided in Paris. And so on August 15, parts of the 1st French Army and the 6th American Corps landed on the coast of Provence. Initially, all these troops are commanded by General Patch. I approve the plan of operations. After landing, the Americans will go to Grenoble, sticking to the road Napoleon. The French will take Toulon and Marseilles and move up the Rhône. In the evening, under cover of the heaviest bombardment from sea and air, the first American units entered French soil between Cavalier and Le Trailat. The landing of paratroopers at Carneuil, Luc, and Meuilly, and of our African landing teams at Réau and at Lavandou took place. As expected, during the night and in the afternoon, 3 American divisions began to land. On August 16 began the advance on Toulon by the divisions of Brosset, de Montsobert, and du Vigier, landing at Réau, at Cavalier, at Saint-Tropez, and at Saint-Maxime, while the Americans were approaching Draguignan. In large operations, it is usually the case that an effort gradually accumulates, and then in a minute there is a rush that unites the various disparate parts in a single rush. The news coming in abundance on August 18 from all parts of the battle shows. The part played everywhere by the French testifies to the coherence of our forces. In Provence de la Traité, seeing the confusion that engulfed the 19th German Army, decided to take advantage of his advantage. On his orders, parts of Lamin and Mansaber finalized the encirclement of Toulon, and some of our detachments are already headed to Marseille. On this day was finally broken through the German front in Normandy. Particularly distinguished at this division Leclerc, fighting since August 11. The road to Paris is open. In the capital, police and partisans begin to shoot at the invaders. Reports are coming in from all neighborhoods that resistance fighters are engaging the enemy. As we wanted, the Allied battle for France also becomes the Battle of France. The French are fighting a common battle for their common homeland. Politics, diplomacy, and arms have together prepared this unity. It is now necessary to unite the nation as soon as it gets out of the maelstrom. I am leaving Algiers for Paris.